SpaceX appears to have failed to submit required data to the U.S. Department of Transportation's Federal Aviation Administration prior to launching 53 Starlink satellites from Florida last August. The FAA has now proposed a $175,000 fine to SpaceX for failing to share that data within 7 days of its launch. The missing SpaceX data is critical, according to the FAA, because it is used to assess the probability of the launch vehicle colliding with one of the thousands of tracked objects orbiting the Earth. The FAA and SpaceX did not respond immediately to AR's request for comment. The FAA has given SpaceX 30 days to respond to the enforcement notice. The FAA has previously clashed with SpaceX over what appear to be risky launches. SpaceX, for example, applied in 2021. Ultimately, SpaceX corrected the issues identified by the FAA, but it was unclear whether the FAA considered fining SpaceX. Musk publicly criticized the FAA in 2021, tweeting that the FAA's space division had a fundamentally broken regulatory structure, and alleging that FAA inspection delays had caused launch delays. While SpaceX appeared willing to break the rules in 2021, Tory Bruno, CEO of United Launch Alliance, urged the FAA that year to enforce regulations and licensing procedures so that all commercial space launch providers take the FAA's safety precautions during launches seriously. Bruno said that if any company violates FAA safety rules and procedures, the FAA should strongly respond with a deterrent set of penalties that will cause them to think twice. Now it seems the FAA is ready to take that advice, proposing civil penalties against SpaceX to ensure all launches meet the FAA's deadlines to share launch collision analysis trajectory data. In other news, SpaceX could be fined $175,000 for failure to properly report launch data to FAA. SpaceX has 30 days to respond to the FAA's enforcement letter. SpaceX appears to have failed to submit required data to the U.S. Department of Transportation's Federal Aviation Administration prior to launching 53 Starlink satellites from Florida last August. FAA. The FAA has now proposed a $175,000 fine to SpaceX for failing to share that data within 7 days of its launch. The missing SpaceX data is critical, according to the FAA, because it is used to assess the probability of the launch vehicle colliding with one of the thousands of tracked objects orbiting the Earth. The FAA and SpaceX did not respond immediately to AR's request for comment. The FAA has given SpaceX 30 days to respond to the enforcement notice. The FAA has previously clashed with SpaceX over seemingly reckless launches. In 2021, for example, SpaceX applied for an FAA waiver, asking for permission to exceed the maximum public risk allowed by federal safety regulations while launching a prototype spacecraft, The Washington Post reported. After the FAA denied the waiver, SpaceX moved forward with the launch anyway, resulting in an investigation and temporary suspension of operations at one of SpaceX's launch sites. Ultimately, SpaceX corrected the issues identified by the FAA, but it was unclear whether the FAA considered fining SpaceX. Musk publicly criticized the FAA in 2021, tweeting that the FAA's space division had a fundamentally broken regulatory structure, and alleging that FAA inspection delays had caused launch delays. While SpaceX appeared willing to break the rules in 2021, Tory Bruno, CEO of United Launch Alliance, urged the FAA that year to enforce regulations and licensing procedures so that all commercial space launch providers take the FAA's safety precautions during launches seriously. In other news, first private launcher Space Tug fails after launching on SpaceX rocket. Space launch startup Launcher said its first spacecraft, which launched on a SpaceX rocket last month, has failed. The Launcher Orbiter SN1, the company's first spacecraft, launched on the SpaceX Transporter 6 mission, which took off from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida last month carrying 114 satellites to orbit, the second most spacecraft ever launched on a single mission. Transporter 6 was SpaceX's 200th flight and deployed a wide variety of payloads, including a Space Force weather CubeSat and a prototype solar sail designed by French firm Gamma. At least one of the mission's payloads has now been confirmed to have failed. In a statement, opens in new tab, published Thursday, February 16, Launcher said that its Orbiter SN1 spacecraft stopped operating due to a loss of power and control. Unfortunately, after that time period, the vehicle stopped operating as we were not able to generate power from our solar panels due to an orientation control issue caused by a fault in our GPS antenna system, Launcher said in the statement. If a company violates FAA safety rules and procedures, Bruno believes the FAA should respond forcefully with a deterrent set of penalties that will cause them to think twice. In the statement outlining the failure, Launcher calls Orbiter SN1 a high delta-V capable space tug, with delta-V referring to the craft's ability to change trajectory or velocity. On the company's website, opens in new tab, Launcher writes that Orbiter can perform any combination of maneuvers to modify your orbit and precisely place individual satellites in their exact locations. This capability allows launcher to place satellites into precise orbits not constrained by their particular launch rideshare, enabling their customers more flexibility in choosing their satellite's final orbits. Following the failure, launcher stated it will redesign its GPS radio and antenna subsystems for future flights to ensure that this issue does not reoccur. The company also said it has improved orbiter's battery charger to allow charging and recovery in nearly all spacecraft anomalous events, as well as doubled the battery capacity. Launcher plans to launch additional missions later this year, on SpaceX's Transporter 8 mission in June and Transporter 9 in October. In other news, on February 9, SpaceX's Super Heavy rocket shattered the South Texas CAM as 31 of its 33 engines ignited in a brief static fire test. Although one engine failed to start and another shut down as the test began, CEO Elon Musk expressed satisfaction with the results. Even with 31 engines, Super Heavy would have achieved orbit. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson was fulsome in his praise of the success on Twitter, noting, "It was great to see SpaceX take a big step forward with Starship's hot fire test. Starship is integral to NASA's Moon to Mars architecture and helping us land astronauts on the Moon. SpaceX's success is NASA's success is the world's success." When he was a United States Senator, Nelson seemed hostile to the idea of commercial space in general and SpaceX in particular. Since then, he has undergone a conversion experience as profound as that of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. The question now is, what comes next? Musk says he hopes that the first orbital test of the Starship Super Heavy system will occur in March. A couple of things must happen between now and the first orbital launch. First, the SpaceX engineers have to evaluate the results of the static fire test and determine if the rocket is ready for launch. Considering the anomaly with the two engines, they may determine that another test is in order before they go for launch. Second, the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) will have to approve the launch. The regulatory agency has been considering issuing a launch license for so long that one has to wonder what is causing the delay. NASA views development of a lunar lander version of the Starship with some urgency. The FAA, not so much. The first orbital flight of Starship becomes crucial when one notes that SpaceX President Gwynne Shotwell suggested that the company would like to launch the mammoth rocket ship 100 times without a crew before putting people on it. Even though Shotwell went on to say that this plan was aspirational, it suggests that SpaceX will need to launch almost every week if it intends to be ready to take astronauts to the lunar surface by 2025. When Starship flies, sooner or later, it will be one of the most impressive events in a long time, whatever happens. Shotwell stated that SpaceX's ambition for the first orbital test is to not blow up. Considering the size of the Starship Super Heavy system, that is a sensible wish that hopefully will be the reality. If SpaceX makes Starship operational, it will have pulled off a history-changing development. It will be the equivalent of Prince Henry the Navigator's creation of the ocean-going caravel in the early 15th century, which later explorers, such as Christopher Columbus, Bartolomeu Diaz, and Vasco da Gama, used to expand European exploration east to the Indies and west to the Americas. The Starship will take humans back to the Moon. Musk would like to use the rocket to go to Mars and found a settlement on the Red Planet. It could be instrumental in opening the inner solar system to human civilization. Recently, SpaceX increased its estimate of how much the Starship could take into space. The reusable version will be able to convey 150 metric tons of people and material into low Earth orbit. But an expendable version of the Starship, that would not carry extra fuel or landing gear, would be able to take an eye-popping 250 metric tons into space. By comparison, the expendable Saturn V could carry 118 metric tons into space, which included the third stage with unexpended propellant and the Apollo command, service and lunar modules. FAA regulators should proceed with all due speed to approve a launch test campaign for the Starship. If environmentalists attempt to file suit to halt launches of the giant rocket, the legal actions should be turned away by the courts with dispatch. Neither the Biden administration nor Congress should cut NASA's budget and thus slow development of the Starship, even to cut the deficit. The Starship is the vehicle that could summon a future so bright that recently it would have been seen as utopian science fiction. It would be a pity if bureaucratic inertia or political malfeasance were allowed to delay that future. Mark R. Whittington is the author of Space Exploration Studies. Why is it so hard to go back to the Moon, as well as the Moon, Mars and beyond, and why is America going back to the Moon? He blogs at Curmudgeon's Corner. Subscribe.